Good morning and welcome to Wisdom Wednesdays. One of the most extraordinary revolutions of human thought is the way in which early Christians talked about God in relation to Jesus and Jesus in relation to God. It used to be supposed that the early Christians started off with the idea of Jesus as a human being, an extraordinary teacher, and possibly the Jewish Messiah. However, it was only later that the good news went out to the Gentile world or the non-Jewish world away from monotheism, that people started putting Jesus and God together. And so more than about 100 years ago, people used to talk about theories about the ancient cults in the Greco-Roman world which will hail some sort of divinity as Lord. Therefore, people claim that's what happened. The Christians went out and got this idea of lordship, and then they ascribed that to Jesus himself. Or they saw on their coins, as many of us could remember in the story of the cleansing of the temple, where Jesus asks whose image is pressed on the coin. The inscription under the image was Son of God. Caesar was called the Son of God. And so perhaps they took that concept and that title and applied it to Jesus. But more recently, over the last 40 to 50 years, scholars have come around to a very different view. And the phrase the Son of God, for instance, comes from the Psalms and other passages in the Old Testament where Israel is called God's son, and in particular the Messiah is called God's son. It looks as though from the very early on the Christians used that phrase, the Son of God, simply because Jesus himself addressed God as Abba, Father. And as we find in a passage like Philippians chapter 2 or like Colossians chapter 1, there are great poems which we see there in the letters, which look as though they are not things that happen because some poets has already taken some pre-existing idea and turned them into a sort of poetry, but because maybe poetry and prayer is the only way you can say some of the things that really matter. Perhaps in those days, through poetry and prayer, the writers wanted to say many things. For example, when we read in Isaiah and in that beautiful hymn, God is working his purpose out as the waters cover the sea. Does that make sense? No, but it's poetry. Poetry that is beholding the beauty and the magnificent, mysterious nature of God. And this type of language is important because in poetry, you come to find that we are able to express 4 or 5 ideas at the same time. In Philippians chapter 2, for instance, my lecturer would call it the Great Philippian Hymn, where it says that we find Paul saying that Jesus was in the form of God and did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but he emptied himself and went all the way to the cross, so that God has exalted him and given him a name that is above every name, that every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And what we don't often realize is that Paul, in this great Philippian hymn, is quoting from Isaiah 45, in which it says that Israel's God is the only one, the absolute God, and to him alone every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess. Paul has taken one of the passages that says there is only one God and has included Jesus within that unity of the one God. A revolutionary idea. Or take a passage like 1 Corinthians chapter 8. I think it is verses 1 to 6, but verse 6 in particular, where Paul takes the prayer of Jewish monotheism. Hear, O Israel, that the Lord thy God is one. And he opens up that prayer to say that for us there is one God, the Father, and one Lord, Jesus the Messiah. And somehow again, he is discovering and identifying the person of Jesus within the unity of being in the one God. Paul here is not abandoning monotheism or Judaism as some scholars and some individuals may say, but because he is saying that the one God of Israel has done something so radically new and yet so much in keeping with what he said he would do, that the only way of expressing it is through poetry and through prayer, in which we see this unity opening up to include once again Jesus, the extraordinary teacher, or the Messiah. So what seemingly happened then was something like this. The early Christians, as we know, came from the Jewish world, within which many people were expecting Israel's God to come back at last in person and in power and in glorious splendor to reign in the temple and to, more importantly, rescue his people. And what seems to continue to have happened is that the very early Christians, looking at the events of Jesus' death and resurrection on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the giving of the Spirit, found themselves telling those ancient stories of what Israel's God had promised to do, and discovering that the only way that they can say that he had done it, was by telling the stories about Jesus and the Spirit. So what we find in the very early days of Christian faith, that they were telling the story about God as the story about Jesus. And now, currently, we are telling the story of God as the story of the Spirit. And the early Christians borrowed all sorts of language. They picked up language from the Bible, they picked up languages from the surrounding cultures, as well as the idea of the wisdom of God, which God used to make the world, which he sent into the world to reshape it. They fused all of these together in a mixture of poetry and prayer, and at times theological reflection, so that although it was 4 centuries later, the doctrine of the Trinity was hammered out in terms of Greek philosophical concepts. The idea that there was one God who is now made known in and as Jesus, and the Spirit was there. All of this was taking place since the beginning. And what all of this have to do with us as Christians? Well, first of all, as Christians, we have a responsibility to be informed Christians, to know about our faith, to be able to express our faith effectively and efficiently. And in order for us to do that, we must understand these key concepts. And one of these key concepts is the Trinitarian view, or the Trinity, the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, because it is one of the principal systematic ideas that describes the way God relates to human beings and Christians at large in the world today. And so by us understanding this, it helps us to understand God to some extent and how he relates to us. And when we could truly have some idea of who God is and how he relates to us, then we begin to explore and to discover our purpose and our function within this Godhead relation in the world. Have a blessed day.